All right. So, hi, friends, and welcome. Thanks for coming to the webinar. My guest today he's listed as Edward Fisk, but folks who know him call him Ted. And that now I feel like an insider when I say that, Ted, but
that's okay. You're okay. Call me Ted. I'm not always sure who Edward is.
Okay. Edward's the guy on the book.
Edward's the guy in the book, right? Yeah.
Right.
In the byline, Edward's the byline. Edward.
The byline.
That's the byline.
Well, we're grateful that folks that you're here, that we've got a chat box, we've got a poll trying to figure out who's here. So we've got 26% students, 40% counselors, and 30% parents so far. Interesting to note. And just in terms of what we're going to cover today, let me just go through the things that we promised. We promised that we would cover a little bit about some of the mistakes that students and parents sometimes make when they're trying to begin this school search process. We're going to hear just a little bit about how the Fisk guide started and why, because believe it or not, it wasn't around forever. Some of you think, wow, that's been around since I've started. It's one of these books that's sort of a canonical book in the college admission world. But we're going to hear a little bit about how that started. And then I want to get into a little bit, Ted, of what it was like this year, trying to create a guide in a pandemic. And then there was an interesting thing that happened where the team decided to drop tests from the Fisk guide. We're going to get into why that happened. And we're going to talk about how the Fisk guide is different, for example, from the ratings that you'll see in like US News and World Report. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how students start to determine which schools are their favorites, because there's so many to choose from. And just to give a quick bio, some of you have met Ted before if you've visited conferences and you've seen him around, but Ted has served as education editor for the New York Times from 1974 until 1991. And he's well known for the big green book that many of you on this call probably have in your office. They're here. There they are. But he's also co-authored, you may not know, he's co-authored a range of other books with Bruce G. Hammond, The Fisk Guide to Getting into the Right College, What to Do when applying for college, Real College Essays that Work, and Nailing the New SAT, among others. Ted, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much for having me. Glad to be with you, Ethan.
Yeah.
These sessions are always fun.
I agree. Yeah. So I want to get into the Fisk Guide in just a minute, but let's start with kind of what the promise of the premise, as it were. What are some, when students are going into this process, or parents are helping students, because this is kind of the time for that, what are some of those mistakes that you feel like maybe folks make when they're just starting out in this process?
Well, yeah, there are lots of them, of course. I would highlight maybe two. First of all is being turned off by the list price. Because I saw a statistic the other day that only 11% of undergraduates in the US pay the full listed tuition. Tuition, room and board, I guess. And colleges basically don't expect all the students to pay this. And every American knows about the rules for going into an auto showroom. You look at the car and you walk around and you take a casual look at the sticker and you say, that's an interesting number. Now what's it going to cost me?
Right. It's like, let's talk.
So that's the same thing with college. This makes for a lot of chaos and a lot of uncertainty. But the fact is, what you pay is going to depend a little bit, or to a large extent, on how much they want you. So there's a lot of negotiating that goes on. There's a lot of negotiating about financial aid and so forth. So the first thing is, if there's a school that you really like, and you think, well, gee, this would be great, this might be my dream school, but oh boy, my parents can't afford that much. That may be true. And you may go through 6 or 7 months of agony and come to that conclusion. But don't write off a school at the very beginning of the process because of the list price, because you may have some particular quality that they really are looking for that year. And then the other general mistake, I think, would be narrowing your sights. The most defining characteristic of higher education in the U.S. is diversity. I mean, compare this with England or Europe or Asian countries. There's 2,400 colleges and universities 4 years in the U.S. There's dozens of schools there that would be a good fit for everyone. And so don't restrict yourself just to the usual suspects. Schools where your high school has been a feeder for, or that your counselor knows, or where your parents went, or God knows what the U.S. News listings say. So just keep your sights open, because you're at the end you're going to be successful. The odds are overwhelming. You will find a place. I know I can't tell this to students in the spring and have them believe it until they find out once they get to a school. Yes, that's great. I really like it. So don't be turned off by the list price, and don't narrow your sights at the beginning.
Yesterday on a webinar, a student who just went through the process, an international student who was high financial needs, said to the listeners, she said, "Don't have a dream school." And I thought that was an interesting phrase. What is your take on a dream school? Do you think that's a good idea, or do you think that's?
I think that's a great choice, because you're not going to. First of all, if you're high school, you've never been to you've never been to college. You don't know what college is like. You probably can't even say what a dream school would be, and certainly 4 years later, you would have a very different concept of what a dream school was. But so I think that makes a lot of sense. Be open. That's especially at the beginning of the process. Let it all flow over you, and go with the flow, and then see what emerges.
I love that. Yeah. So let's take us back then. Talk to us about the kind of the origins of the Fisk guide. How did it start? And importantly, why?
Well, we're going back way back. I mean, we're talking about 40 years or so. By the late 70s and the early 80s, the last of the baby boomers had worked their way through college. So high school graduation rates were declining, or numbers were declining. And a lot of schools, at least the second, third, fourth tier schools, were getting a little desperate about, will we be able to fill our classes? So the colleges became quite aggressive in their marketing. Now, we look back on this and it's all rather quaint. This consisted of 4-color brochures in the mailbox, and audio, videotapes, and cassettes. Remember cassettes, those sorts of things. So it all seems like pretty quaint, but at the time it was pretty radical. And colleges were coming up with a lot of marketing schemes, some of them pretty harebrained. And I had a lot of fun. I wrote about this for the New York Times. I had a front page story. I wrote one for the business section. I had a piece in Atlantic about the same thing, because they were doing really silly things that were really fun to write about. I remember, I'll give you one example. There was a school in the Midwest which is pretty flat, and there was a heavy rainstorm, and so a huge puddle accumulated in the middle of the campus green. And so an eager photographer for the college went out, and he took a picture of what looked like a lake in the middle of right next to Old Main and all. And he got some students to sit around the littoral of the lake. And so sure enough, that picture appeared in the View book next year. But one thing that the people doing the editing hadn't noticed was that 2 of the students up in the upper left-hand corner were smoking joints.
Whoops.
Whoops. But it remains to be seen. That could have led to a huge increase in applications.
It's hard to track at that point. It's like,
hard to tell cause and effect there. But anyway, so the colleges were getting more aggressive in the marketing. And so I was having some conversations with a publisher of Times Books, which was an imprint of the New York Times during that period. And he wanted me to write a book, and we came up with this idea. Let's come up with the New York Times college guide that will come in on the side of the student and the consumer, and cut through all this propaganda, which at that point was pretty one-sided from the colleges. And so that's how what started as New York Times Selective Guide to Colleges came into being. Now, it turned out to be pretty controversial, because I was saying things in the guide that I couldn't say in the front page of the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was, for example, specifically one, I said that at that point, Syracuse University did not really care all that much about its undergraduates, which happened to be true. They radically changed their attitude within the next decade. Maybe I helped them make the change. But anyway, so the Times, Punch Sulzberger, the publisher of the Times, said, we're going to continue to publish the book. We understand it's a quality product, but it's too controversial, so we're going to take our name out of it. So I got a huge amount of publicity and the book. And then, long story short, people basically started referring to it as a Fisk guide, so it became eponymous. And the last 35 years or so, guide to colleges. And what we were doing, it was essentially is a journalistic effort. I mean, journalist goes out, asks people questions, writes down what they say, and publishes it. And what I was trying to do in the guide was to capture the institutional personalities, the distinctive institutional character of the various schools. And the method was to use questionnaires. So we, I mean, if you want to know what it's like to be a student at a school, what's it like to be at your school? And we found out about the social life and the academic life and the relations to faculty members and the extracurricular and all that. And then we sent questionnaires to the universities, and they gave us data on admissions data and so forth, and information about core curricula and that sort of thing. So essentially, it's a continuation of what I was doing as a journalist writing for the New York Times.
Yeah, and I imagine, I make up that it's been different, but maybe not in this past year. Getting that kind of information or tracking how schools are changing. What's it been like creating this guide in the past?
Well, in a sense, I just went, ooh. It's, as I said, the main thing that we were trying to do was to capture the culture and the institutional personality of the school. And these cultures don't change.
And give us an example. So for students,
I'll tell you, the best example, the most long-standing one was with the University of Pennsylvania. When I was, when we were writing the first edition of the guide, I was reading the student questionnaires that came in from the University of Pennsylvania, and there was an undercurrent of anti-intellectualism, which ran through them, and I didn't make any sense. Why am I seeing this in the open-ended questionnaires from students at an Ivy League school? So I put it aside, put the pen right up aside, and I interviewed Vartan Grigorian, who passed away a couple of weeks ago, who was then the provost at Penn, and there was an anthropologist wonderful name, Digby Baltzel, who'd written about how the Philadelphia and the Boston elites had handled their universities, and then the history of the founding of the university by Benjamin Franklin. And what I realized was, what I realized that one of the things that Penn was singularly good at in relation to other Ivies was that they were into practical knowledge. They were big on service learning and service research, and that there was this hands-on knowledge to be used, not knowledge for its own sake. And then when I look back at the history, these were the values of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was obviously very bright and innovative, but he was ultimately a pragmatist. Electricity, bifocals, diplomacy. He was just a very and then even though I grew up in Philadelphia, I didn't realize that the liberal arts at Penn was basically a post-World War II phenomenon. Penn made its reputation over the years as the first business school, first psychological clinic, first in his med school and so forth. So it was in the professions, and it was only after World War II that they really made huge investment in the traditional arts and sciences. So put all this together, it makes sense that a college with this tradition of blending high-level thinking and research with practical knowledge had persisted for over 2 centuries.
Right.
And the idea that the comments, the unsolicited comments, or the undirected comments from current students would reflect the values of some guy who died 250 years before sort of blew my mind. But
right.
it's the culture, and it's persistent. It's always made Penn distinctive, and so you could tell the story over and over. The colleges that when Vassar started accepting men, or Yale started accepting women, their cultures didn't change.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, so the women who went to Yale were similar in lots of ways to the men who were already there, and vice versa at Vassar. Yeah. And I find this really fascinating.
I do too, and it makes me wonder. So what I hear is like there's this persistent thread of the school is pretty much like this, and yet I'm sure there were some changes this year, right? And how do you account for those, right?
Let me actually answer your question. So what I'm making a big leap of faith, and that is that once we're back to whatever the new normal is, the traditional cultures are going to reassert themselves. And so I didn't even try to keep up with the changes in the dorm regulations, because they were ephemeral anyway. And I've got to assume that the readers are going to understand this. So when I talk about this particular aspect of Greek life or something, they're going to realize that's not the situation that is absolutely current right now. Right. But I'm just assuming, based on what I've known about all these, what I was saying before about how the cultures are so persistent, that they're going to reassert themselves. And basically, that's what I'm trying to say, to convey about each school. And each school has a different culture. I mean, the big editorial risk when I started to write the guy was, once you'd written about the 17th small liberal arts college in Ohio, where the faculty often invited students to their homes for dinner, they would all blend into what turned out not to be true. The histories are different, and colleges that look the same are upon, once you lift the veil a little bit, they're very distinctive, and that's what's fun to read about, and that's actually one of the things that should make college hunting an interesting enterprise for the students and parents.
So have you felt over the years pressure to say nice things about folks? In other words, because this can have an impact on potentially enrollment, have you felt pressure to sort of, play nice with all the schools, or how have you navigated that over the years?
I don't pull punches. I don't want to be responsible for sending a college down.
Right.
But I don't think I've ever been in quite that position. It would seem a little presumptuous that I could. I mean, and colleges don't tend to close very much. Marlborough's now closed in Vermont, which I love. I'm really sorry to see Marlborough go. I would have done everything I can to keep them going, but if only because do you know what their mascot is or was?
I don't remember.
The mascot for their sports, which
wasn't the Marlboro Man, I imagine.
No, it's the Fighting Dead Trees. For their ultimate frisbee team,
It's kind of sad.
So you can't make this stuff up, but it's fun. So I can't. One of the things about writing about is it's fun, because colleges are really interesting places. So I'm really sorry to see Marlboro go, because I can't say that anymore.
So was the process, I don't know if this is really super interesting to folks, but it's super interesting to me, of like, was the process of receiving the information from schools this year and then creating the guide, was it relatively similar in terms of, here's the way this is going, or was it?
Yeah, our method was the same.
Okay.
And we got the questionnaires, and we read the questionnaires, and we follow up and with questions. And so our process for doing it didn't change.
Yeah. One thing changed, the decision to drop tests. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, as you know, college guides have traditionally published the test score ranges, ACT and SAT score ranges, which is the 25th to the 75th percentile. So what are the scores of the middle half? And the goal has been basically twofold. From the point of view of students, colleges have their own reasons, but I only try to think about what's good for the students. One, it's going to give you a sense of whether you're going to be admitted or not, so that could help. And then secondly, it'll give you a little bit of a sense of how you're going to fit in academically into the academic culture. So there's been reasons to do this, but given the pandemic, but actually even before the pandemic, the usefulness for either of these two purposes has been diminished. Most dramatically has been the growth of test optional schools. Yeah, so there were at least 1,000 of the 2,400 colleges in the U.S. that were test optional at the beginning of the pandemic. By now, it's around 1,700. So you have roughly 2/3 of the colleges are either test optional or don't even require it at all, or don't even look at them. Just last week, the UC state universities and state colleges announced they weren't even going to look at SAT and ACT scores. So you had a lot more of test optional schools, and then there were closing of lots of test sites. So hundreds of thousands of students, even if they wanted to take the test, didn't have access to it. So the Common App announced, I think, in March, they said that only 44% of the students who are applying to colleges this year through the Common App had even submitted tests, less than half, right, down from 77% last year. So from 3/4 to less than half of the number of students submitting the scores. So as a result, there's the test score ranges. They're not describing even close to the scores of the entire freshman class.
Right.
It's only the scores of students who are able to take the test, right, and then chose to send the results to the college, which adds another level. And so colleges, of course, love this because their averages go up because only students who have good scores are sending their colleges. But the result is the information is useless. And as a journalist, I tend to have a bias against false information. Yeah, and so it just became it's meaningless. It's now meaningless information. What the future, how it's going to play out in the future, I don't know. But then there are also some broader issues that were in the back of our minds that we'd already been thinking about, besides just what I did mention of the test optional and the closing of the sites. Colleges for some time have been relying less and less on SAT and ACT scores, not for any ideological reasons, but they're just finding them less useful. Their own experience is that, but you're looking at the combination of the students' curriculum choices and the grades. There's what courses you pursued and how well you did it. But that's a much better reflection of the it's a better way of figuring out what the student's going to bring to the college. And as I said, UC Systems is just the latest one that's announced this. And then there are a whole slew of other broader issues that went into our thinking. The SAT system, the test scores, they really favor privileged students. There are important ways in which they perpetuate structural racism and inequality. It used to be that there was this fairly compelling diamonds in the rough argument that the SAT was a way of getting beyond the quality of the school at all and identifying students who are really bright, even though they might not have an academic background. That's no longer works. It's you have a $1 billion test prep industry, which has tilted the scales totally back in favor of privileged students. So there are just a lot of broader issues, even apart from the pandemic, that cause us to not want to have to be involved in promoting this data.
Yeah, I'm gonna just see if any folks love to ask questions about this. So I'm gonna see what's coming through in the chat box. One question that's coming in. Let's see. If you don't test, how do you distribute merit scholarships? And I know you're not technically a counselor. I know you might have an opinion on this. What is your sense? How then do schools distribute merit scholarships?
Well, they're gonna. I don't know, and I'm glad I'm not an admissions director having to do this. I mean, I'm a journalist. I'm just saying why I'm not going to produce phony publish phony information. But I think it does go back to what I said before about are you challenging yourself academically, and are you taking whatever AP courses, or at least some AP courses, are available in your school, and how are you doing? And then there's also letters of recommendation and other aspects of the transcript. So they're going to have to go back to relying more on the transcript and these other things. But the test score data is just fraudulent, so it doesn't. You have to find a way around it, and you're going to be struggling to do that.
That seems to be a pretty good answer. And to the person who asked it, I don't remember exactly what it is, Barbara. Tomorrow night, we've got the quick plug. We've got another webinar with 3 different admission officers, and you can ask them what it was like this year. And I imagine I have some sense of what they're going to say, but I'll come tomorrow night and ask that one of them.
Yeah, are they thinking of leaving the profession?
Yeah, probably not. So let's talk about, you mentioned U.S. News and World Report. I'm going to ask you a loaded question. I'm loaded because I know we've talked about this before, but how are the ratings in the Fisk guide in terms of what schools are good for? How are those different from U.S. News and World Report?
Okay, I'm glad you used the word ratings, although that's not a great word, but not rankings. And the big difference is that the College Board ranks colleges 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, they say this school is better than this school. This school is number 92. This school is number 106. And there are a lot of problems with that. And by contrast, what we do is we give stars to the colleges in 3 areas: academics, the social life, and the quality of life. And we're basically, I've said several times, this is a journalistic enterprise. What we've done is taken our cues from restaurant critics who give stars to restaurants. It's a way of giving a hint to the reader. Here's a way to interpret what we're saying. So we give these numbers in the 3 areas to the schools, and it is kind of a shorthand for what you can find in the write-up. Anybody reading the write-up carefully would probably come to the same listing. We don't have some sort of extra knowledge that's unavailable to anybody. But yeah, so if you find a school that has this particular configuration, then look for other schools that have the configuration you might be interested in it. So we don't rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because there are lots of problems with this. It has real ethical issues to begin with, but there's at least 3 big problems with the U.S. News rankings. First of all, it asks the wrong question. Question is not what's the best school. It's what's the best school for me. Mm-hmm. Or is Brown better than Dartmouth rather than would I do better at Brown or at Dartmouth? So it's asking the wrong question, and it's asking the wrong question. Secondly, the criteria. If you look carefully at the criteria, what the U.S. News rankings essentially measure is institutional wealth. It focuses on inputs, value of the portfolio, and so forth. They don't measure. They don't get at important things like how students relate to faculty members, because you can't do this statistically. And then thirdly, it creates a false sense of precision. I mean, is there really, I mean, think about it. Is there really any fundamental difference between school number 8 and school number 18? It's oversimplifying. And, I know the editors who created all this, and they say that the rankings originated as what they call a journalistic parlor game. And it really hasn't progressed much beyond that, even though there's a lot of discussion of being responsive to colleges' complaints. But they're powerful.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've had conversations with students where they will say things like, "Well, this school is 21 and this school is 18, and this school is giving me a little bit more money, but they are 3 spots higher." And it's
it's absurd. And so, but they know how to market it. More power to them.
So I want to get into the position of the student.
Let me say one thing. Yes. The U.S. News can be useful for some of the information. The data that's there. If you know this is an important factor in deciding between schools for you, you can compare and find out how colleges would fare on that. But they have their formula, and your formula for what's a good school for you is going to probably be very different.
Right. Well, so I want to get into the perspective of the student who's entering this process, or the parent who's feeling maybe overwhelmed a little bit, and they've got this, for example, let's say they've got the Fisk guide, they've got this resource, and it's comprehensive. It's got all this information. How do they use something like this in their process? How do they begin to suss out which schools are? How do they do this whole process thing?
Well, I would say, I mean, let's start with some of the things besides just using the guide. I would encourage people, especially during the junior years, to visit different types of schools. They can be local. They aren't even necessarily schools that you would probably want to go to. But most high school students don't really understand what it's like at colleges, what the institution is like. They certainly aren't like high schools. And so visit schools of different types. Visit the state university or a small liberal arts college or a religious-oriented school, and get the flavors. And one, that'll give you a sense of what the colleges are all about, but it'll also give you a sense of what kind of questions you might want to be asking at a school that you are seriously considering. I would say talk to as many people as you can. If you're at parties, or if you're parents of friends who, you went to DePaul. What's DePaul like? Is it? I hear they have a really interesting fraternity system. Is it? Blah blah. So
if I cut you off and say that there's one thing that yesterday I was talking to my colleague, and she was like, she's visiting schools right now, and her daughter said to her, "Mom, you're like a walking Fisk guide." What pops into my head just now is like, man, you're like a walking Fisk guide.
I take that as a compliment. I'm a journalist. I ask questions. I write down what people say. It's not very complicated. This is not brain surgery. Talk to people. Just bring your conversations around it. Where did you go? What did you like? What didn't you like? And at that point, you can take. I encourage people to pick up the Fisk guide. The only person I could never convince to pick up my guide was my daughter, and she was looking for colleges. And I once said, "Julie, I'd really be encouraged if someday I might walk by you on the couch and you were looking at the Fisk guide." And she said, "I don't have to. I have you."
Wow. Well, true.
End of conversation. But then, so, start reading and browsing. I mean, you don't want to start at Adelphi and read all the way through to Yale, although I've been told some compulsive people have done that. But check out some write-ups. If there's a school that intrigues you for some reason or other, read it. But then look at the overlaps. At the end of each write-up, we have a list of schools that they share large numbers of applications with. And so this is a way of taking advantage of the experience of previous college seekers. If you were looking at Amherst, you benefit from the fact that other people who looked at Amherst were also looking at Wesleyan and Bowdoin and so forth. Because colleges tend to compete in niches. And so the overlaps is a way of identifying the niche that a school is operating in. Yeah. And that's a way of kind of broadening a list. So if you start with 2 or 3 schools that you like, then look at their overlaps. That'll get the list up to probably 8 or 10. Look at the overlaps of the overlaps, and by then you've got a whole mess of schools, and you can begin to do some serious research. And then, of course, online. I mean, there are a lot of go to the online websites, especially those ones that you can where you can talk to students. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of resources.
Yeah, you talk about the overlaps for folks who are listening. The overlaps is like there's a little section where you can look at, here are other schools. If you're thinking about this school, you might consider these other schools. And there's another.
Yeah, based on where other applicants have applied.
Right.
So it's data driven. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a colleague of ours, Stephen Antonoff, who wrote a different book who has more of those sort of overlaps. And that's a good one for seeing what schools are good for. And if you're thinking about this school, here's another one. Yeah. So I'm hearing touring, and obviously if they can't tour in person, there's so many virtual options available, right? And figuring out what is that sort of institutional vibe by asking tons of questions. And I say that because some students I know will say, well, what if you can't visit, or what if it's not safe to visit? Then there are lots of virtual options for that. There's certainly sites also, and we'll share a couple in the follow-up email that allow you to kind of tour virtually. Let's see.
Yeah, I mean, there's really no substitute for spending an overnight on a campus, if you can. But I understand and maybe it's a minority of opportunities these days. Because, but if you can arrange to spend a night in the dorm, about 10 o'clock, everybody stops studying and kicks up their heels and schmoozes, and you can just get a sense of who the students are. And it doesn't take very long. I mean, one day on a campus, and you can pretty much nail what you need to know about the culture of that place.
Yeah, someone's noting in the chat. FYI, I keep getting emails from schools that are starting in-person visits. My son and I have gone on many this spring, or we've gotten a tour from an alum of. So these are happening. They're rolling back out now, and.
And during those tours, don't be afraid to ask pointed questions to the guide. I mean, you've got these people.
Give us some good questions.
They've been well trained, and they're really adept at walking backwards without crashing into trees. But you can now ask them, what's it really like? When you go into the cafeteria, are the blacks in one group, the Asians in another group, whites in another group? You can ask whatever question occurs to you. Don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah. One question coming in from Zara is, she's asked, they ask, how do you decide between university and liberal arts colleges?
I'm not sure I've got a general answer to it, because again, it's where you're going to feel comfortable. I mean, do you want to go to a big school or a small school? And one of the things we have in the front of the Fisk guide is a sizing yourself up guide. It's a list of about 15, 20 questions, which don't have right or wrong answers, but just to get I try to help you identify your style. Do you like to be
in large classes and sit and listen to people talk, or do you want to be part of the conversation? Questions like that, again, that don't have right or wrong answers. So it's a matter of personal taste. If you went to a very large high school, maybe you want to go to a more intimate college. Or if you went to a very small high school, maybe you want to be in a bigger university.
Mm-hmm.
You can also keep in mind that a lot of the larger universities, because students are so sensitive to the sense of community that they're going to be part of, and people want to be part of a meaningful community. So what a lot of the larger universities are doing is creating smaller communities within them. It can be a dorm organized around a theme such as international relations or veganism or whatever. So
bacon.
Yeah, and then there are honors colleges. Arizona State has a really good honors college, which is about the size of a small liberal arts college, and its culture is very different from the huge rest of the university. So there you have a liberal arts college with its own faculty and all within a big university.
Mm-hmm.
So the two aren't mutually exclusive. So you might want to be part of a community, a smaller community, but also like to go to the Division I basketball games and things like that. So it's not necessarily an either or, because colleges are realizing they've got to be a little bit more flexible in their marketing.
Yeah. Well, and folks who are listening, feel free to just throw questions into the chat box. We're in Q&A time here. Nan asks, how do you recommend finding a quote unquote fit if you're not sure what you want to major in?
Well, you shouldn't have to be sure of what you're majoring in, but I'm always put off by students who say, well, I'm going to go major in anthropology or what. One of the purposes of a college education is to let you know about things that you don't even know exist. And most students, or a high percentage of students, probably change their majors 2 or 3 times in the course of their career. So I'm always suspicious of people who are, I know I'm going to be a math major. Well, maybe you want to be a mathematician, or if you're going to be an engineer, that's a little different because you have to start taking certain kinds of courses. But one of the whole purposes of education is to osmose, be in an environment where all sorts of new things are happening, and you're aware about all the interesting things that have been, as Matthew Arnold said, have been done and thought and done in the world. Or you may even find yourself attracted to a particular professor, and the professor might teach medieval Urdu, and say, okay, I think I'm going to do medieval Urdu because this guy's turned me on to it. And, you can use that as a vehicle for all kinds of learning. So keep an open mind. Don't be unless you have a very clear vocational destination in mind. And, even pre-med, a lot of med schools respect when somebody who's pre-med doesn't just major in biochem, they major in philosophy. Because in the world of modern medicine, you need a richer set of skills, not just the science. So I would say don't just resist closing any doors. Maybe there's a theme to what I'm saying is, keep your mind open to new possibilities, and that would include majors.
That's good advice for these times, I'd say. Well, Hayden asks, what should I assume about a college or university that is not included in the Fisk guide? I'm looking at a university that isn't listed in the guide.
You should include that it is, you should not conclude that it's an unworthy institution. We have about 325 schools out of the 2,400 or so possible schools. So we have to make a lot of hard choices. And when I get lots of correspondence from people saying, I answered a letter today from somebody who wanted to know why we didn't include Washington State, but we did include
what's it? What the small liberal arts, state liberal arts college. And yeah, I'm blocking on. Anyway, but we have to make choices. And so what we do is we have all of the really competitive schools, public and private, but then we want a mixture of public and private schools. We want to include niche kinds of schools, so that trying to serve readers with various interests. So we have single-sex schools, we have religiously oriented, we have Protestant schools, Catholic schools, Mormon. So we have schools like, there's no reason that you would probably pick out College of the Atlantic and include it in the guide. It has about 450 students. It's located in the coast of Maine. It only teaches ecology. It's obviously not for very many students, but it's interesting, and it's part of that diversity of American higher education, which one of the sub purposes of the guide is to convey the diversity of American higher education and all the various options. So I look for some HBCUs, and then we look for geographic diversity. And then some we include just because they're fun to write about. we want the book to be entertaining. I mean, we're writing little essays. We're not just doing formulaic statistics.
Stephanie asks, what do you say about the concept of return on investment that many parents are so concerned about these days?
Well, my wife's an economist, but we don't. I don't pay much attention to it. I mean, return on investment, does that presume, what profession are you going to go into? What's going to be generating the return? Are you going to be director of an art museum, or are you going to be a financial consultant? I mean, it's, I realize people are concerned about this, but I don't find it a particularly meaningful concept because there are too many imponderables involved in it. What are the values? What kind of a career do you want? Are you going to stop or not go into social work because it has a low return on investment in your college tuition? It's a crazy value system.
Here's a personal question. How did you choose your own college?
Okay, that's a fair enough question. I went to Wesleyan, which is a small liberal arts college in Connecticut, very high quality. And this was a long time ago. I wanted to go to this was when Amherst, Williams, Wesleyan, were all single sex. So I was going to a small men's liberal arts college in New England, and I wanted to be able to do a lot of things. I didn't want to just have to specialize in one extracurricular activity. So I played 3 sports. I edited the newspaper for one of my senior year. I just wanted to be able to do a lot of things. And I knew that if I went to a larger school, I would have to specialize in this. So I guess I was restless and curious and wanted to do a lot of things, which are qualities that lend themselves to being a journalist. So I guess maybe that was the reason. And I'm glad I did.
Yeah, this is cool.
But not for everybody. It's not a good reason for everybody. Yeah.
Right. Some of the students that are on the webinar here are international students, and some have asked things like, what do you think about international students, timing of the college list? What should we consider? I'll give a quick note before I want to hear your take. What do you think? What advice would you give to international students as they're going into this? But I'll just say to folks who are on the email list, in about 2 weeks, we've got a bunch of resources particularly for international students, and several specifically for high need international students as you're navigating this process. We've spent the last 2 or 3 months writing a lot. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of resources coming your way. So stay tuned on the email list. But I'd love to hear your take here, Ted. What advice do you give to international students as they're thinking about pursuing education in the United States? And what happens if they need money? Do they have a shot? What's your sense?
Well, it's, as you know, the number of international students is declining.
basically partly for political reasons that they don't feel so welcome, or they haven't in recent years. It is true. It's hard to get financial aid if you're an international student, and for a lot of schools, they see international students as cash cows. I mean, they want international students. I would look for a school that has a critical mass, because that also signals that there's a certain international orientation to the culture of the school. Remember, I'm talking about the culture and the institutional personality. So you get a school like Kalamazoo, for example, has been very internationally oriented, both for its own students and students coming abroad. Goucher requires all of its undergraduates, or at least it has until the pandemic, to have an international experience. So I think getting a sense of whether there is an international interests and perspectives are part of the culture of the school would be important. And I think that's important for American students, but certainly for an international student. You might look to see who the international students are at a particular school, and are they from your area of the world, or even your country? Because sometimes students, these colleges specialize in particular areas. Mm-hmm. But it's hard, and in recent years, the British universities have looked a lot more attractive to students than American ones. But I'm hoping this will change. And then the whole question: what sort of support systems do they have for international? Is there a counseling office that's dedicated to international students? So try to look at what support structures you're going to find, because you're going to need them in one way or the other, if only with just practical arrangements, travel and financial aid and moving money about and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So I love those. I want to just repeat those for international students listening. Some great questions to ask. Number one, what kind of international community already exists on campus? And then that's the student side. And then on the second, like on the institutional side, what kind of support exists for international students? Those are two really great ones. Alyssa's asking one that I kind of asked earlier, but let's revisit it. Are there any other favorite questions that you have that you particularly liked, that you would ask, that you would maybe advise students asking of either current college students or admission officers when they're trying to determine that fit?
I would a really good question to ask, and this is to recruiters coming to your high school or on campus tours: who's going to teach me my freshman year? I mean, there are a lot of schools that have very high, lots of Nobel Prize winners and all, but you don't see the full professors until you're a junior year, till you declare a major. So right. Am I gonna spend a year or even 2 years in big lecture courses before I get to dig into my major? Now, colleges understand, or at least a lot of colleges understand, that this is a problem. So what they've been doing is starting up freshman seminars, or other ways to give freshmen right off the bat in their first semester, give them a high level seminar experience. So give them an exposure to what high level college intellectual inquiry is all about. So a lot of colleges, even if they have big lecture courses, may have these special freshman programs. And that's a sign that they take this seriously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll give a quick personal example. A good question for me when I was thinking about what I wanted out of a college was, I was interested, and I ended up going where I got in and, got financial aid. So this wasn't super, like, I really thought this through, but let me rephrase this. Had I been applying now, I would ask, what opportunities as a prospective theater major are there for me to create theater on my own? Or as a prospective film major, how many years is it before you can get a camera actually in your hands? Because at some schools, that's freshman year. At some schools, like you're saying, Ted, it's junior year or beyond.
Yeah, so and you can always go and ask to talk to a faculty member in the department. If you have specific areas of interest like that, say, gee, I'd like to visit this theater and talk to one of the faculty members.
Mm-hmm.
and talk to some students.
Right, right. One student's asking, what advice would you give to, and I'll say a quick thing about it, then I want to hear your take. What advice would you give to undocumented students? And if you, by the way, to Jocelyn asking that, if you Google undocumented students college essay guide, you'll see a whole bunch of resources, both for essays and also for thinking about paying for college and developing the list. But I'd love to hear your.
I think I would duck that question. I don't have any real expertise in that.
That's fine.
I try to avoid talking about things that I don't know anything about. Not always successfully, but
I appreciate your honesty. Let's see. Do you feel, here's an interesting one. Do you feel that the quality of academic advising should be a criterion? If so, how do you ask about that or find out about that in a way that won't result in a cookie cutter answer? For example, the kind of answers that you often get at info sessions and on tours. How do you get a real answer out of somebody? That's kind of a...
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And the counseling has become, especially vocational counseling, has become a much bigger area of concern. Ask students. I mean, or read the Fisk guide. That's one of the questions we do is we ask every student who's filling out a student questionnaire, what is the counseling? What is the quality of the counseling programs? And then we were also asking about things like how they're dealing with institutional racism and sexual assault and things like that. But we've become much more attuned in recent years to the quality of counseling, and we feature what students say in the write-ups. But when you're visiting a student, a campus, you can make this one of your questions, but ask the random student, not the tour guide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it. I like the question on Unigo that asks, what is the stereotype of students at your school? And follow up, is the stereotype, to what extent is the stereotype true? I think that's a pretty good one. Someone asked, what resources do you recommend for students with learning disabilities or who may need academic support on campus? And Chris responded that the KMW guide is a great resource. And I just want to second that. Mary Beth Kravitz and Amy Wax have done an awesome job with that for years and publishing so many resources for students with learning differences and disabilities.
Yeah, we have a section in the Fisk guide that highlights some schools, but it's not in depth.
Yeah.
One of the things in that is a lot of these programs have a lot of turnover. Mm-hmm. So it's really important. You may look at they might have 4 people working with it, but by the time you get there, none of them may be there. So you have to be very careful about how persistent the faculties are in these.
Right. One thing I want to mention, we'll take a couple more questions here in a second, but we have a little link. There's a little promo code. If you're interested in getting the Fisk guide that I'll just put into the chat right now, you get 10% off, and it's done. And that code expires in 3 days. So I'll just put all that info in. So the promo code is right there, 10FSK01, and that's at that link. For folks who are interested, just a little extra spending cash for folks. Ted, what when you think about sort of, it's sort of hard to forecast, but what I heard you saying just now as we sort of wrap up is, I hear you saying that one, you sort of made a bet that colleges are going to return to normal. Is there, as you sort of look into the foggy crystal ball, and this isn't a hard question, I know, but like, what do you see changing, if anything, as it relates to, for example, testing? Or actually, let me ask a more open-ended question. What do you see changing potentially, and what do you see staying the same in years to come?
I think one of the really interesting questions, and this applies to various areas besides higher education, is how much of what we were forced to do during the pandemic are we going to decide has some continued usefulness? So I would be very surprised if schools didn't find ways of using virtual learning, not as the dominant teaching method, but as a way of creatively supplementing things. So it's going to be really interesting to see what schools do to preserve this. And those are the kinds of questions that we're going to be asking for the next round.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have no idea what the answer is going to be, but we ask questions and write down what people say.
Right. Right. That sounds like a pretty, I mean, it seems that's a pretty good way to do it. Someone asked, when is the Fisk guide out? It's available for pre-order. It's coming out July 6th. Michelle asked, is there an online version? There certainly is. Ted, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. I always enjoy our classes and our sessions. I mean,
yeah, me too. And thanks for just all the work you put in over the years. It's just,
likewise,
it's been a huge, contribution to our college admissions world.
And I wish all of the people who are viewing the best of luck in their college search. One of the things I always mention to people is, the odds of your being successful are overwhelming. There are literally dozens of schools that are going to be a good fit for you, and you'll find one. And this is not something you can convince students in the fall of their senior year that is true, but eventually they'll come around and realize that you will be successful. And colleges are really interesting places, so have some fun. You got a lot of interesting people doing interesting things. So yeah,
I love that. I love that. There's I'll put in the chat box for those of you who are actively involved in the college list development. The link that I just put in at the top, there's a step-by-step guide to developing your college list. So as y'all are working through that, it's the specific, okay, here's what I do, and then here's the other thing I do, and then here's the next thing, and all of it's covered there. So I welcome folks to check that out. Again, Ted, thanks, and I'll look forward to next time.
Okay, me too. Thanks.
Be well. So feel free to click out. There's like a 15-second delay thing that happens, but you can click out and I'll edit it later. Thanks, friends. Be well.